Hi, everyone. Welcome back to EQ2 Community Conversations. We are so happy to have you all join us here today. As you may know, our goal in these webinars is really to share knowledge around best practices, implementation tips and strategies, and just connect more broadly with our EQ2 partner agencies, EQ2 partner agencies, and those of you who may be EQ2 curious. Before we get started, I will briefly introduce myself, this webinar, a little information about Lionheart, and then last but not least, introduce our amazing guest for today, Dr. Steve Brown from the Traumatic Stress Institute and the Risking Connection Program. As I'm talking, I really invite you to please feel free to use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen to introduce yourself. Tell us where you're coming from, your name, the agency, and your location, where you're at. If you don't already know me, I am Dr. Jess Linick, co-clinical director at Lionheart. On the call with me today behind the scenes are many other folks on the Lionheart team, Beth, Jen, and Stephanie, so you might see their names pop up answering questions in the chat. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A feature. And a big thanks to everyone who submitted your questions beforehand. We're going to try to get to all those questions live. We may not, but this webinar will be recorded. You'll get a link to view it in a couple of days. And of course, you can always reach out to us and you'll get all of our contact information at the end. If you don't already know, Lionheart, we are a nonprofit organization that's been around for over 30 years. All of our programs are trauma-informed and work to build social emotional skills in the populations that they were designed for. Many of you joining us today use EQ2, our staff self-regulation and support program, which at its core is designed to help direct care staff build the essential and often very complex social and emotional regulation skills that they need to do their jobs well and to truly implement trauma-informed care. We have the privilege of working with systems around the country, from small group homes to huge residential and DJJ facilities and even state systems. So hello to Kentucky and North Dakota, our states. And we are always so heartened when we hear how much focus and real effort people are putting into how they transform their systems from just trauma aware to truly trauma informed. And that's why we are so excited to have Dr. Steve Brown with us today. Steve, feel free to introduce yourself, or I will introduce you, show your face. Dr. Steve Brown. Hello, Steve. He is the director of the Traumatic Stress Institute of Klingberg Family Centers. A clinical psychologist, he is a primary architect of the Risking Connection Change Model, TSI's internationally recognized whole system change process to trauma-informed care. He's also a co-creator with Dr. Courtney Baker of the Attitudes Related to Trauma-Informed Care Scale, or the ARTIC, one of the first psychometric measures of TIC. He trains professionals nationally on psychological trauma and trauma-informed care. Hello, Steve.
Hi, Jess. Thanks for having me. Great to
Oh, nice
see
to meet
you.
you. Great to see you. So nice.
Welcome to everybody out there whose screens I can't see, but glad you're all here.
But we can see you in the chat. So hello to everyone. And again, feel free to put, questions, thoughts as we're going through in the chat. But Steve, I really wonder if we might just start with an overview. We have all heard of trauma-informed care. It has been the buzzword, I think, in residential and DJJ over the last 15, 20 years at least, but many people define it differently. And we also know it's not a one-time fix, it's an ongoing process. So wondering if you might really ground us for a moment in a definition and in the framework that you all use when working with folks to really help them understand the pathway to trauma-informed care.
Yeah, really, really good place to start, as there's a lot of often vague definitions out there. I think
Yeah.
the definition that we use that we found most helpful is the definition that SAMHSA came up with way long ago and back in 2014, which is the four R's. It's really about systems, and with an underline around systems. Trauma-informed care is really about systems. It's not about training an individual clinician or doing kind of one-time thing. It's about system change, and it's systems that kind of realize the prevalence of trauma, who recognize its impact on the people that we support and the people that we serve, It's about responding through a trauma-informed lens on a moment-to-moment basis, both in terms of our interaction with our clients and our interaction with our colleagues on
Mhm.
that level as well. And finally, about resisting re-traumatization. Really, the trauma-informed care movement came out of the consumer survivor movement that basically realized that not only were they not getting better in our systems, that in fact they were getting worse, and that lots of re-traumatization was happening, and I would say still happens. And so it's about how do we resist through the trauma-informed system change to that re-traumatization. The other thing I'll share, I'm going to share a quick slide here. Um,
We love a good graphic, Steve.
can you see that?
We can, yeah. I don't know if you want to make it so that we can share your whole
Yeah, I'll put it
slide.
in the whole screen there. Let's see. How about that?
There we go. Perfect. Yep.
So this is, I think, really, really helpful. This is something that sort of originally was called the Missouri model, which kind of talks about kind of different stages, evolutionary stages, developmental stages up towards trauma-informed care as the end goal, starting with kind of trauma aware, when basically organizations are first beginning to understand the prevalence of trauma, the importance of trauma, its impact. The middle stages are really about when you begin to think about staff training and looking at policy and your practices through a trauma informed lens. And then, sort of at the end, really trauma informed, which is when it's fully embedded, it's part of the culture, it's part of sort of the DNA of how you work as an organization. And I think part of the importance here is that many organizations that do sort of piecemeal stuff will say, oh, we're now trauma informed, when in fact they're really earlier in this developmental path. And so what we really are about is how to kind of help people move down this developmental path towards being kind of having it be really part of the air you breathe within your organization. So that's, I think, was a good place to start in terms of definitions.
Yeah, I love that, Steve. The air you breathe, that it's not just a piecemeal thing, as you said, that some different folks get exposure to or get some training in, but that it really becomes the gestalt, the kind of default operating mode of the agency. It makes me wonder, like, if a system is either they're wanting to start progressing down that pathway, or they, after looking, at that diagram or thinking and evaluating their policies, they're like, oh, I think we're actually trauma sensitive and not trauma informed. How might you
Uh-huh.
suggest they start thinking about moving down the pathway kind of more generally? What are some recommendations you have?
So again, I think, like you said, it depends on where you're starting. If you're sort of in the very beginning of just trying to establish some kind of awareness within your organization, or you may begin in a pre-aware stage, then I think you're talking about trying to bring in experts to do some staff training, trying to think about, like, can you have a number of clinicians have some more training in trauma specific techniques? You're trying to think about how to build leadership buy-in, getting leaders to kind of understand. Some organizations have even, like, done an ACE study amongst their clients to have data saying, like, now we know that, you know, 25% of our clients have four or more ACEs. And so to kind of build that case. So if you're kind of more in the middle stages, you've already done some training, your clinicals have the expertise, you begin to look through a trauma lens. See, that's when many people come to us, because I think they begin to realize that, yes, we've done this, but there are so many forces pushing towards the punitive. Many of our agencies have kind of a legacy of punitive practices. We have a lot of staff who have their own trauma histories. We know that clients with trauma histories evoke really strong feelings in us, including we get afraid. And when we get afraid, what do? We control. We want to control. We get punitive. We get shaming. So and not to mention when there's staff turnover and budget cuts, all of these forces are pushing against trauma-informed interventions back towards the punitive. And that's why, organizations that might even, implement trauma specific or implement EQ2 are feeling like, okay, but this is not quite enough. There's still a lot of, you know, a supervisor is treating someone, a staff person in a kind of punitive way in their supervision. So that's when we really see the importance of working as a whole system and trying to not have it just in one department, not just with certain kinds of staff, but making it part of a common language, a common framework, common view. Are you training your receptionist? Are you training your maintenance worker? Are you training the people in the kitchen staff, who of course have lots of interactions with youth? Are you thinking about that in kind of systemic way? And that's what really is our niche. That's our bread and butter.
Yeah, yeah, I really love that, Steve. And, really reminds me of sometimes the way I'll think about kind of trauma, and we sometimes think of it like a vortex, and you're in this like trauma vortex kind of hurricane place, and how do you come out of that is to have something else that's equally as strong, if not stronger, which is having that trauma informed care, as you said, really embedded across every single facet of your agency in a very meaningful, clear way. And so tell us about Risk and Connection. Tell us about the Risk and Connection change model and how you all support agencies in infusing this in every single facet of their agency.
Sure. Um, okay, as they say in sports, back to the videotape.
We love a good graphic. As I said, we love a good graphic.
So this is our infographic. This is what we call the Risk and Connection change model. This is a 18 to 24 month change model that we do with organizations. And it starts with lots of leadership engagement up front. What we know, if leaders aren't committed and bought in, it's really gonna struggle in the organization. We meet with executive leadership, board of directors. An organization forms a trauma-informed task force from the very beginning to lead the initiative. And then about 3 or 4 months later, with some work in between, we do our initial what's called Risk and Connection trauma training. Risk and Connection is a foundational trauma training. It's 3 days. It's something organizations adopt as a mandated training program for their whole organization. It's 25 years old today, so it's been vetted in many different settings. It's really a terrific trauma training, core trauma training. And then we do a train the trainer, where we train trainers and champions within organizations to be able to train this training in an ongoing way, roll it out with all staff, train new people who come in the future. Champions reinforce what the trainers are doing. And then we provide coaching for how you roll out this training and other kinds of interventions you might want to do in the trauma-informed directions, like looking at policy or having more support for compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma. And then we also provide long-term continual support for those trainers who are credentialed, so that they stay up to speed. And we offer, if you have trainers who turn over, we have other opportunities to train new trainers, so that you always have a cadre of trainers and champions within your organization. And throughout it all, we do program evaluation. We use our ARTIC scale at 3 different time points along that initiative in order to know whether the kind of needle is really moving around trauma-informed change. So that's really kind of like how we roll it out. And what we find is that organizations really begin to own it, to to keep it alive. They're seeing kind of their staff want to go to this training. They're seeing restraints and seclusions going down. There's some anecdotal evidence that really helps with turnover. So people are really experience a lot of benefits from this kind of profound change. And so when those punitive forces happen, you have this training that everybody's had and a language that everybody's had in order to kind of resist those natural pull towards the punitive.
Yeah, I love that, Steve. And I'm seeing here, it looks like you've got some, I don't know if we call them adaptations or at least some training for maybe all kind of more specific populations. So does risk and connection exist also for different populations of staff or people who,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so particularly in the last 5 years, we've adapted our model to the developmental disability sector and are now working with probably 5 or 6 developmental disability client agencies. We've actually taken that core trauma training, risk and connection, and adapted it specifically for IDD organizations. It's actually, instead of a 3-day training, it's a 2-day training because oftentimes IDD organizations have less training time for staff. So we've made it condensed it into a shorter training, but it has parts that are very specific to the IDD world. And of course, what we know is that almost 100% of people who are supported by IDD organizations have histories of bullying, history of sexual violations, history of physical abuse. Just living in an able-bodied world as a person with disability is a kind of an adversity in and of itself. So I think that sector is really beginning to kind of understand how important knowing about trauma is.
Yeah, I think what you just said, Steve, is so important. When maybe historically we have thought about trauma, trauma had a very specific kind of definition. I know when I was trained, I'm sure when you were trained, trauma there was like this much smaller, quote, smaller categories of trauma. And now here we are thinking about all of the ways that trauma actually shows up and impacts us on very macro levels when you're talking about kind of whole agencies, punitive responses to events being almost an agency traumatic stress response, right? All the way down through the micro interactions that we have with youth and with each other on a day-to-day that can be so heavily impacted by trauma, by adversity. We are doing this study, I think we've told you, with Purdue University and University of Albany, looking at the prevalence of trauma in direct care staff in some of our EQ2 partner agencies. And data is still ongoing, so I won't kind of, spoil the whole thing, but I will say that the trauma prevalence is just so high, much higher than the general population. And this is something I think anecdotally we all know, but we may not have had a full appreciation of how much trauma and adversity is showing up on the floor with our direct care staff.
And one of the things that we so commonly hear from people who go through a risk and connection training is the way in which it impacts them professionally, but also the way in which it impacts them personally.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
that people with trauma in their history kind of get it in a different kind of way. And the framework that we talk about and the way in which we talk about symptoms as making sense, behavior is making sense given, and their survival skills. It's such a way of people understanding in a positive way about how their difficult behavior is really has been a strength, a way of
Yeah.
survival. It may not be
Yeah.
working in the present so well, and have some negative, but it's a way that they survived, and how amazing is it that they survived? And to frame it in that way helps people kind of think about their own histories in a different kind of way.
1000%. We see that all the time when folks go through EQ2. It really helps them understand themselves better, understand each other better. And what you said about, this translating not just for work skills, but home skills and life skills, that self-regulation and being trauma informed is not just, it's not that it applies in one place and doesn't apply somewhere else. that it applies really everywhere. And these skills are things that can really support us in so many facets of life. So I actually wonder if that's a good kind of segue, yeah, into how you see EQ2 and risk and connection working together. What do you
Well,
think about
this is your
that
graphic,
our model?
which when you trained our community, I said, I love that graphic. I'm going to use that graphic. Because I think this talks about sort of the way in which risk and connection creates this kind of umbrella system, philosophy, way of thinking, kind of in the DNA, whereas these other interventions, incredibly important, work kind of on a different level.
That's right.
And that if you have one of them, it's good, but not nearly as powerful as having multiple interventions in this way. And again, we see sort of the combination of something like a system change model and kind of EQ2 as uh, that much more powerful in, again, resisting all these punitive forces that are so prevalent so often in our organizations.
That's right. That's right. And as we say, about EQ2, that if you yourself or your staff do not have those self-regulation skills online, that it becomes very difficult then to implement these bigger kind of trauma-informed care models, because it's just something is there's a little bit of a disconnect sometimes if we are really struggling kind of on the floor. And so I do want to take a moment to invite, and I'm going to put this in the chat, but I'll say it here too. If you are an EQ2 agency and a risk and connection agency on this call, and you want to take a moment to just share your thoughts about how using both maybe might be different than using one or the other, any other thoughts you want to share, please feel free to put that in the chat. We do have an ability, if you want to come off and talk, we can make you a co-panelist for a second, but we're going to switch over to talk about something else, but really would love to open it up if there are any agencies using both on the call to really share your
And
experience.
big shout out to all our Risk and Connection client agencies out there who are listening. We love you and support you. We currently work with have about 85 client agencies in 24 states and 3 Canadian provinces who have been using Risk and Connection, some for as much as 20 years. So yeah, I think one of the things that I feel a lot of pride in is that this is not the shiny object that you innovate and implement and then 2 years later is gone. We want to make this something that stays in the organization and is sustained for the long term. And I think we're really proud of, I think over 60% of our client agencies have been using it for 10 years or more,
Oh,
actually.
wow.
So
Amazing. That's amazing. We say about EQ2, and I think this is true for risk and connection too. This is a marathon, not a sprint. This is not something you come and you plop in and you say, okay, great, we've done it. Now we're trauma informed or now we're self-regulate. It's no, like this is an ongoing process because, circumstances change all the time in agencies, in our world, and we have to be flexible and adapt. And so, um, Oh, I love this. Hi, Danny. Danny, I'll just read so folks, in case you can't see in the chat. Danny says, we utilize both at Lad Lake. We have staff going through the risk and connections right away when they come on board. It's super helpful for them to get a background in trauma-informed principles and have that carry into the work we do with EQ2. Thanks, Danny. Awesome. So if
thanks,
other folks
Danny.
are on, feel free to share. But Steve, we got some other questions about how you measure trauma-informed care. And so I'm really so curious to hear about the ARTIC, the attitudes related to trauma-informed care scale. Tell us about the ARTIC, all the things we got to know.
So the Arctic scale is a measure of staff beliefs, favorable or less favorable towards trauma-informed care. And it is at this point the most widely cited psychometric measure of trauma-informed care and the most widely used globally. And it is a way that organizations can track whether they are, again, making progress toward down that pathway. Organizations use it as an assessment tool at the beginning about like, where are we? If they're doing an intervention, whether it's risk and connection change model or other, it's a chance to see kind of how things change. It has actually 7 subscales. So it looks at different elements of beliefs, like beliefs about whether your system is really just words only or whether they really buy in. It's a beliefs about whether your staff see like youth behavior as willful and intentional, or whether they see it as basically they're doing the best they can at the moment, and it's a survival skill. It's like, where do the beliefs, and so it can help you figure out where to focus training, where in the organization you need sort of, whether your leaders need to kind of boost it more. So it can have lots of it can drive database decision making in the organization, and organizations can kind of can use it themselves if they have kind of an evaluator to help crunch the data. For selected organizations, we also have like an automated online version where certain organizations that meet certain criteria can use that, which sort of administers the measure automatically, kind of via what's the word I'm looking for, like online data collection, and spits out reports both for the organization and for the individual. So there's different ways that you can use it.
That's so cool. And there are different versions of it, right? One is a little bit longer, one is a little bit shorter.
Yep, there's a 10 item short form that's you don't get the subscales, but you get an overall score. And then there's a 45 item, which is what most people use, which has the full subscales to it. And there's one for education settings and one for human service settings. Really, the only difference is one uses the word client, the other uses the word student for kind of education settings. A lot of educational settings have used it all over the world, actually. A lot of people are using it for research, a lot of researchers. So it's been a great project for us.
We're using it in our, we're doing as we're rolling it out across EQ2 across the whole state of Kentucky. The ARTIC is part of one of the tools that we are using to measure
That's
outcomes.
awesome.
We're
That's
really
awesome.
excited about that. And I think, I know we've had a lot of conversations about kind of what we're measuring and how we're measuring, and the beliefs piece seems to be such an important facet, because beliefs don't lie, in a way that, as we're measuring behavioral outcomes, as you said, reductions in critical incidents or restraints or turnover, those kinds of things. But why is that happening, and the how of that happening is hopefully folks' beliefs are changing. And I think that's just another area of overlap between both risk and connection and EQ2, is we are also on the EQ2 end inviting staff to share their beliefs about child rearing, about apologizing, about teamwork behavior, really giving them that open space to take a real non-shaming look at, like, what are the beliefs I hold about my job, my role, the youth that I work with, and is there opportunity for growth and change and maybe some different beliefs to come in alongside that. And so I really love how much overlap there is in that area.
Yeah, we believe that beliefs drive behavior. And if you can shift beliefs to being kind of more trauma informed, you're more likely to have the moment to moment behavior again with a client that is more relational, more compassionate, less shaming, more understanding of where these behavior comes from. So all of that is kind of a key thing that we measure through the ARTIC.
Yeah, I mean, that's CBT, right? What I think changes how I act, and then the piece of how I feel, there's the self-regulation piece. I can catch how I'm feeling, the body response that I'm having, inhibit that dominant response, and remember what we call them cool thoughts in EQ2. There may be different words in risk and connection for what are the things I tell myself to reframe this in a trauma-informed lens so that I can show up in the best way for the kiddos that I work with.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So one more question maybe before we get into the audience questions is, with so much changing in the field of trauma, I'm so curious, what are your hopes for the future of trauma-informed care, kind of where you see it maybe going?
Well, I've said some of this already, but I'll reinforce it here is that, um, you know, the good part is that people are recognizing trauma in all different kinds of settings, all different kind of sectors. I think that the troubling part is that people want to only do sort of piecemeal kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
And they do what we call a lot of train and hope. They'll train
Yeah.
and then just hope that like a couple trainings are gonna, and then basically the handout goes in the file cabinet and not much is remembered. And so, kind of getting people to understand that changing real culture takes effort, energy, resources, and that it's really worth the investment to try to change that kind of the air you breathe, and that is really kind of where you're going to see kind of the eventual outcomes and see that you're having many less police calls and you're having many less restraints and seclusions, and that staff are end up being kind of happier in their jobs and seeing themselves as treaters. We have a thing, we call everybody in an organization a treater because we believe everyone in their interactions can be
Beautiful.
healing. And
Yeah.
therefore, to see yourself as a treater and that you're changing brains through your moment to moment interactions with
Great.
youth and kids makes you feel like your job is valuable and you're not just a babysitter
That's right.
sitting there. And so we really believe that comes from looking at it as a whole system. So again, and not just to implement, but to realize it takes effort to sustain this over time. There is a lot of gravitational pull towards control in our organizations, with the wider kind of even U.S. culture now is feeling more punitive. How do we push back against that punitive influence? And we believe that, again, living and breathing a relational trauma informed approach is going to make it so you're able to stay healing. Again, it's that idea that trauma happens in the context of relationships, and therefore healing happens in the context of relationships. And unless you're nurturing that healing relationship, both through your supportive staff and through your work with clients in those interactions, you're gonna, that's where the rubber meets the road.
So well said, Steve. So well said that if we are not in those nurturing relationships, we may be in fact doing more harm, and so how can we really show up in the best way for youth
An
in our care?
essential And an
Yeah,
essential part of risking connection is about vicarious trauma. And if you think that the relationship is the agent of change, both pieces of the relationship have to be healthy. And
that's
this
right.
applies to EQ2 in terms of emotion management, but it also applies to, are we as organizations taking care of our staff so that they can set the conditions that they can care for themselves and do this work for the long term,
Yeah,
because they have to be healthy to be a healing agent. And
that's
we can't have people turning over every 3 and 6 months. From an attachments perspective, we have kids who have major attachment wounds. If the staff is turning over every 2 months, that's just kind of rupture. But if you have staff staying for a year and a half, 2 years, then those relationships can have the potential to be much more healing, powerful agents of change.
yeah. I think that's so true, Steve. So true. Um, we did have, we got many questions from the audience, and I think one of the biggest questions we got, and this is a question I'm sure you get a lot, and there is one that we get a lot on the EQ2 end. about this word accountability as it relates to
Mhm.
trauma-informed care. Folks thinking that if I go the trauma-informed care route, I'm going to be soft. Kids are going to get away with things. So tell us your thoughts. Kind of what would you say about that? How does Risk and Connection approach that topic of accountability?
It's such a common insidious myth about trauma-informed care is that it's about being nice, about kind of only asking people about their feelings, that it's about sort of just letting kids do what they want to do, and nothing could be further from the truth. That what we talk about um, is that you can set firm limits in a compassionate way. You can set firm limits in a shaming, punitive way. Um, Daniel Hughes, who's done a lot of writing about attachment, has this image of a steel box with velvet lining, like a very firm box with limits, but with a velvet lining that does it in a relational, compassionate way. And that's true kind of when you're talking about supervisor, supervisee, or colleague to colleague. You can um, hold staff accountable in a very punitive way, or you can do it in a relational way. And trauma-informed care does not mean we don't deal with conflict, that we avoid conflict. Conflict, we believe, is inevitable. It's inevitable with your clients where they're not going to like something that you do and that they're going to hate you for it. And that is part of the work. And we, rather than responding in a punitive way, we understand where that comes from, and we work to say we can work through this conflict. We can still maintain our limits, and we can get to a place where the relationship is stronger. If you make it through conflict with a supervisor or a client or a colleague, in fact, your relationship gets stronger afterwards. So it does not mean that we just push conflict under the rug. We in our department in TSI, we always talking about, conflict needs to come out. If you have a chat problem with another staff person, we talk about it, we deal with it, and that's kind of, I think, the kind of culture you want to foster, and it will ripple down into kind of the work with clients.
Yeah, yeah. The idea that, we are all human, and we are going to have these things are going to come up inevitably, but that doesn't mean that, because they're difficult conversations, we avoid them or we ignore them, right? Or that with youth, we become overly permissive, or no, I love that steel box with velvet lining, that because like having good boundaries is part of trauma-informed care. It is part of how we learn and grow as humans, as we know the limits of what we can do in the world. And we recognize that if we bump up against them, we're not awful humans. We are folks that maybe need to look at changing our behavior, and that's it. And we can
And
have
what and
conversations.
what I would argue is that frame and boundaries, being clear about frame and boundaries and sticking to them is the most important part of work with trauma survivors, because as we teach in Risk and Connection, the definition of trauma is a transgression of boundaries,
Right.
that
Yep.
people are used to the boundaries being transgressed. So if you are very thoughtful, conscious, deliberate about setting limits, you are in fact healing. If you're letting kids do anything they want, that is just basically re-traumatization rather
Right.
than really healing interventions.
Yeah. Yeah. Trauma as by nature, a boundary violation, a boundary breach. Yeah. Well said,
Right.
Steve. I love this. One other question, I think, before we wrap up, hopefully we've got some time for it, but folks really asking about leadership, how leadership demonstrates and messages buy-in and commitment to making what feels sometimes like real complicated change in systems. So what would you say about for the leaders on the call, or for folks wanting to take this back to their leadership? What are good things for leaders to do?
Well, I think first is sort of modeling. Are you modeling in your leadership style um, a relational way of interacting with people? Can you hold boundaries and yet allow input and collaboration? And how do you manage the tension between that? Can you hold people accountable for doing their jobs in a professional way and at the same time kind of build connection and relationship and trust with them? I think that is sort of essential. Are you if you have folks who are your champions of trauma, are you authorizing them to have kind of authority within the organization? Are you highlighting their work, kind of raising up their work? Are you dedicating resources to trauma-informed change? It takes resources, both financial and human resources, to make
Right.
this change. Are you willing to kind of make that dedication and commitment and really understand that this is not a short-term thing? This is a long-term effort that needs nurturing along the way. So all those things that I think are leadership, really important leadership characteristics that will make it more likely to happen.
I love that. Thank you, Steve. Thank you. It reminds me of in mere moments, folks are going to get a little QR code on the screen. They can download the EQ2 app. But one of our newest features that we love is a praise feature, a shout out feature where staff can shout each other out and supervisors can shout out staff. So
That's
as
great.
it's
That's
so
great.
cool. As we close out for today, really want to thank everyone for coming to this EQ2 Community Conversations webinar. As you know, we really could never and would never be able to create the programs we do without our community. And so from the bottom of our hearts, we thank everyone who showed up. I know Steve feels the same way about his risk and
Yes.
agencies. This is really a process of co-creation, that we are all in this together, and we are stronger together. If you would like to learn more about the Risk and Connection model, thank you. Jan is just on it before I even say it. She's on it. Jan just put a link to the Traumatic Stress Institute's website where the Risk and Connection information is all there for you. As it says on the screen, if you want to get a feel for what's in EQ2, if you are not currently an EQ2 agency, the QR code will give you access to the EQ2 app, which is one part of EQ2. EQ2 is much bigger than that. We have handbooks. It's done in restorative circle practices. We have an online facilitator training, but the app will give you a good flavor for kind of what's in EQ2. We'll also be sending, along with the recording of this webinar, all this information in an email. If you have any questions for Steve, Jan is going to also put in the chat the link to speak to a consultant for Risk and Connection. You can also email us at eq2@lionheart.org, and we can get your message over to Steve. We know that we couldn't get to all of your questions today, so please reach out to us if there's a question we can answer, questions Steve can answer. We really, as we've said probably 80 times, we are here for you. We want to hear from you. And these webinars that we do for EQ2 are ongoing. We do them about twice a year. And so if you are an agency that is interested in doing a webinar like this with us, we'd really love to hear from you. So please feel free to reach out to us for that. Steve, any last words on your end before we close
Just
out?
just thank you to you, Jess, and to Lionheart, and I really appreciate you inviting me. It's been really great to get to know you and to begin to kind of collaborate more. I think what we do has so much in common, so many threads in common. So it's just been a delight to get to you and to talk to all your community. I think I will say that this work can be incredibly isolating. It's hard work to do. We can feel alone in it a lot, which means that the having a community of EQ folks, and for us having our Risk and Connection community, people feel less isolated. There's a common bond that people feel that I think really addresses how hard and isolating this work can sometimes be.
I'll close with this. I often quote Judith Herman, who, if you don't know her, folks, she is the originator of the term complex trauma. She's written a couple of really beautiful books. But she says, if you are going to work in the trauma field, to never work alone. And I think, Steve, what you just said really highlights that we are in this together. Don't do this work alone. Yeah. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you to everyone
Thanks,
who came.
everybody.
We are so excited, and have a beautiful, beautiful rest of your day, everyone. Bye.